My name's Jonny Hawkins, and I'm going to share with you some of my favourite stories of some of my favourite people, the sort of stories that I tell at parties that are getting boring. I could hear Paula before I saw her. This fantastic, big, roly-poly voice. She sounded like a female Winston Churchill. I was at the Dublin airport waiting to catch a plane to Marrakesh. I could see a group of people standing around the source of this wonderful voice that was holding court in the airport food court, which is one of my favourite sentences. She'd launched into a story and everyone was in the palm of her hand. I made my way through the crowd and finally I saw her. This short, squat little woman with a big black shock of hair and thickly drawn-on eyebrows. She had a fake tan on, which didn't make its way into the wrinkles of her neck, so as she looked around her audience, the white showed through like brambles reaching down from her chin to her chest. She wore a heavily starched white shirt with the collar popped, gold jewellery. She had houndstooth pants on and knee-high tan boots. Her eyes were dark brown and wet. She was an alluring woman, but make no mistake, she was terrifying. Suddenly, without even looking at me, her hand shot out and it grabbed my wrist. "Who are you? Where are you from?" I'm Jonny. I'm from Australia. "Oh, how marvellous. And where are you going?" Morocco. "Us too. Holiday. What about you? Why are you going to Morocco?" I told her I needed to buy a rug. "An Australian in Dublin flying to Morocco to buy a rug? Stupidest thing I ever heard. You'd get a fine rug in Galway. I'll take you rug shopping in Galway. You'll get a good deal too because they know me. They know Paula." I soon learned that Paula was travelling with her niece Arwen, who bored her to tears. I think Paula was trying to set me up with Arwen when suddenly she asked, "I'm going to address the elephant in the airport, Jonny. Gay or straight?" I didn't feel that the question was fair, so I answered it in this way that I do without answering it. I said, "I do my thing, Paula." "Well, what does that even mean, Jonny? Jonny. All signs point to gay. Sorry to say, sweets." We boarded the plane and Paula was sitting in the front row of the Ryanair flight. She was sitting next to this monstrously tall man who looked like a James Bond villain. He'd obviously booked the seat in the front of the plane and paid extra to get the leg room, and I thought that maybe Paula had booked the seats at the front of the plane so that everyone would see her on the way in. She threw out one-liners as we passed her, perched up front. "Valium can turn an economy flight into business class. Just add water. Ha ha!" She looked people dead in the eye and made commentary of what was going on. "I remember when flying was glamorous. People don't dress up for flights anymore, do they?" She had this strange power about her. Everything that she said was barked, but it was so charming you couldn't help but feel flattered when she barked at you. Her voice pressed the meaning of her words into the listener. She was not subtle. She was probably rude, but nobody cared at all. We wanted her to bark at us next. She made us feel like children at a show that required a volunteer. "Pick me, please, pick me." I took my seat halfway down the plane, somewhere in the mid-20s, and sitting by the window. I was sat next to a sweet but very irritating Irish couple. She'd set up the stories for him to tell. She'd say, "Have you ever seen Vikings?" And then I'd say, "Well, maybe." And he'd say, "Well, you might recognise me. He's in it every season." I soon learned that I was sitting next to a featured extra in television's Vikings. And while I had never seen the show, I had now seen a lot of pictures of this man holding onto a severed head on his iPad. This was going to be a long 3-hour flight, I thought to myself. The plane took off, and moments after, the very tall man from the front of the plane, he was at my row. He said, "Excuse me, are you Jonny?" Yes. We're changing seats." His voice sounded a little defeated. I looked towards the front of the plane and Paula was now standing with a drink in the air, pointing at it, waving me over, yelling, "Jonny! Jonny, come down here!" as if I couldn't recognise her. Paula had arranged for me and this man to swap seats. The man, the very tall man, he was not thrilled about it. He'd been hoping for that extra leg room, and Paula had somehow convinced him to move, and he was at best reluctantly consenting to Paula. I went down to the front of the plane, and she had folded down the flight attendant seats, the ones that they use when the plane takes off or lands, and she'd made a booth and was now hosting a soiree mid-air. I wasn't the only person that she'd invited to her party. There were other people there too, all laughing and drinking the cocktails that she was making. Try it! I call it a Ryanair. It's the cheap vodka with the cheap champagne. They disguise each other's flavour. The party was being held next to the toilet, so as people got up to use the facilities, they had to pass by us. And in the brief moment before they went into the restroom, Paula would have to start a little preliminary chat with them. And when they were out of earshot, she'd turn back to us and say, "What about them? Are they groovy?" as she decided whether or not they could join us. Of the 5 seats, 4 of them were always filled. One of them was only ever filled briefly, and there was often someone standing. At the moment that the 5th chair was filled, she would tap someone on the leg that wasn't holding their own in the conversation and say, "Thanks for coming," and then stare at them until they left. This was a party with a high turnover. I never thought of myself as being a competitive person, but when I saw how people were being ejected, I learned that I can rise to the occasion. I was never made to move. Perhaps it was because I was the one driving up the volume of the party with all the drinks that she was pouring. It was not a long flight, but mark my words, I was completely trolleyed by the time that we landed. At a point, a sweet-faced man, a flight attendant, came over to break up the party. "Hiya, you having a nice time? Well, I think it might be time to..." "Time to what?" You know, I don't respond to hints. Say what you mean, lad." "Well, it's just that some of the passengers have said that it might be nice if the party was to finish up now." "Well, who? Send them over. I'll buy them a drink." "Oh, I wouldn't want to say." "Well then, we'll just carry on, shall we?" "Yeah, that's fine. Have a good time." And he hurried off. Another young man who was at best reluctantly consenting to Paula. By the time that we had landed in Morocco, I had never been more drunk in my life. Landing in a dry country, half in the bag, wasn't ideal, but it was worth it. Morocco has a way of pushing its tourists into the same spot, so over the course of my trip, I ran into Paula and Arwen quite a few times, and one night I caught up with Paula, just with Paula. "Nope, she's not joining us. I sent her off. She's family and all, but Jesus H. Christ, it's hard to love an accountant, even if they are your niece. How boring. What a waste. Let's drink." I spoke to her about her life. She said, "A thing happens when you're in your 70s. It takes getting used to, but I'm good at it now. I can do wild things, and I won't ever get in trouble. When I'm acting up, the worst thing that happens is someone with an average sense of humour will step in and start speaking in that perverse, sweet tone exclusively reserved for the elderly. A tone that says, 'I'm not here to manage you, but I don't think you're competent, so I'm going to help you.' Then they try to help me do things in spite of what I desire." Paula was obsessed with the theory of the singularity, where artificial intelligence becomes smarter than humans and the computers take over. She said that she believed that if the machines took over, they would be kinder to women than men have ever been, and made an unrepeatable remark about how she could prove it from her own sex life. After leaving Marrakesh for other parts of Morocco, I didn't think that I'd run into Paula or Arwen again. But back on the flight to Dublin, sure enough, in the front row, rinse, wash, repeat, there she was, doing it all again. Though this time it was Arwen who was swapping seats with me. She wasn't invited to the party. I've always found spectacular women like this, well-travelled women who know exactly who they are and what they want in the world. There's a woman called Bunny Ash who lives in New York City who shamelessly talks about the husbands that she's outlived and the money that she's made from the institution of marriage. Traditionally, it goes the other way. I know a 65-year-old DJ in Melbourne who had previously been one of the most feared and well-paid madams in the kink scene. She said that she DJs now because it's easier on her wrists. Each week, I plan to tell stories of mine about interactions that I have with the elderly. at a time when it's hard for us to connect with the elderly and care for them and listen to their stories, I think telling stories like these will keep them top of mind. Thank you for listening.